All right. Welcome. You are looking live, as they would say. We are here on a Monday nights for The Other Side, episode 20. Today, we're going to be taking on Venezuela. And welcome to all of those that are listening for the first time. Really excited to have you guys along with us tonight. One of the things that I wanted to talk about before we jump into the episode is Mike had mentioned in his last episode that we were going to, here at the beginning of the year, be putting some emphasis on beefing this up a little bit. And he and I talked a lot over the break and even into today, just kind of talking about trying to get a commitment to getting out an episode weekly. In addition to that, looking at also getting some graphic work done, maybe some soundtracks and things of that nature for the podcast as well. We're also going to be looking at rolling out the other side of, which would be more of an academic side to this. When we first kind of started talking a little bit about the concept of this podcast, it was intended to kind of help us explain our perspective, something that we're not really able to do sometimes in the classroom and things of that nature, but really to just kind of as a therapeutic method. But we also really wanted to, and we knew we were honest with ourselves and realistic in knowing that it would take a while to build up any kind of an audience. And I'm encouraged that I have had some people reach out to me, contact me through social media, which I always encourage on every episode. But I just wanted to take a moment to say, if you happen to be listening live with us tonight, welcome. If you happen to listen to this in a rebroadcast or through YouTube or what have you, we catalog all of our podcasts on YouTube, and just encourage you to go back to our YouTube channel and you'll find all of those previous episodes cataloged on there. We've done some episodes through a platform known as Spreaker, which is great for an individual to be able to record their podcast. This we have found works out well with the joint or tandem podcast, and that's what Mike and I have tried to go to a little bit more here recently. We've even brought on some other people as well. We're always looking for that, looking to bring on others just to get as big of a perspective as we can on the concepts that we're talking about. So having gotten those housekeeping things out of the way, I want to go ahead and start to transition us into our topic for this evening, which, as I mentioned, is going to be on the current situation and climate in Venezuela. I mentioned this as an issue in the end of year review episode that we did, where we talked about the good and the bad of 2017. This was one of my negative things, because in addition to not only, knowing what's going on there, the lack of attention that this seems to be getting, and I know there's only so much that can be discussed and talked about in the news cycle, but I really feel like for whatever reason, this is not getting the run that it needs to be getting in the international press, but also here at home as well. I think it's definitely something that needs to kind of be on the forefront, just to be aware of for us as citizens to know what's going on. It's also a great teaching moment, as we're going to talk a little bit about today. So just to quickly bring you guys up to speed, and then I'm going to bring Mike in. He's going to talk primarily about the economic climate and what's going on behind the scenes with the economy of Venezuela. There's a lot of moving parts with what's going on down there. And then he'll kick it back to me, and I'll wrap up with some of the governmental issues of what we know about socialism and Nicolas Maduro, talk about some of the impact on the culture and the region down there with some other countries. So just to bring our listeners up to speed here real quick, what we're facing and looking at in Venezuela is an unfortunate situation where the government-run economy, right, is really put a damper on the daily lives of its citizens. The socialistic tendencies of the Maduro regime, along with the stronghold from a governmental perspective, is just creating a very chaotic. It is literally descending into chaos, as we hope to kind of explain and demonstrate to you today. And to get you to truly grasp, and as you listen to this, I hope that you can kind of try to conceptualize what we are saying to you, and to try to understand what the true scenario looks like inside of this country right now. And that's our main goal, I think, is to kind of help explain to the listeners. When you hear people in this country talk about the ideas of free healthcare, free education, free transportation, free housing, all of these things that are associated with socialistic economies, that this isn't just what's happened in Venezuela. We can look at other situations, whether it be Cuba, North Korea, Russia, China. It just doesn't work. It doesn't hold up. And unfortunately, we have this most recent example of what's going on in Venezuela to help prove that. So, I'm going to challenge those that may think in that regard to kind of think a little bit about the ramifications of things of that nature. So that's going to kind of be the model for what we're going to take a look at. So having kind of set the tone for what we see here, just utter chaos. People that are fleeing the country, they're leaving because of how desperate they are. Those that are left behind are literally ravaging through anything that they can get their hands on. The currency is just spiraling out of control. Hyperinflation is through the roof. So a lot going on here. And so to kind of break down the economic side, I want to bring in Mike Margison here. So welcome, Mike. How are you this evening?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic, and I'm really looking forward to kind of tackling this one, because I know that, as you and I have talked about on several situations, we have colleagues that are not too far off from ascribing to these political and economic ideas. And certainly, even within our government, we have senators and representatives and town officials that espouse these ideas, and the rhetoric and the emotion that gets involved in the discussion oftentimes dominates, and unfortunately facts get kind of buried behind what this really truly means. So I'm hoping that between you going through the economic stuff and me going through the government stuff, we can bring the listeners up to speed with what this really means.
Yeah, no, I agree. And look, first of all, in Venezuela, let's make clear, in Venezuela, what we're seeing right now, this is socialism. This is socialism at work. It's not anything else. What you see in, like what Bernie Sanders refers to, when he was in his campaign for presidency, he talked about Denmark and Norway. Those are not socialist countries. A socialist country is Venezuela. A socialist country is North Korea. It's Cuba. These are the hardline Marxist socialist nations and the socialist economies that we have to go by. And I mentioned that, I think it was in podcast 8. I talked about the differences between capitalism and socialism and identified that difference. And I'm going to come back to that. But I want people to understand, when I am talking about what's going on here in Venezuela, like stories about people who are breaking into the zoo so that they can butcher and eat animals because they have literally nothing else to eat. That is socialism. And this is socialism at work. When you have, like you said, people foraging through dumpsters, eating garbage, killing their dogs and cats so that they can eat them. This is socialism. Denmark, not socialism. Venezuela is socialism. And let me say something that I think might be a little bit surprising to people who know me. Look, if the world were going to end in, let's say, 3 years, and we knew that, and our goal was to improve the economic quality of life for every single person on the planet, I would actually back socialism as the best opportunity to do that. Right? So if the world were going to end just 3 years from today, I would embrace an economic redistribution, because I think that that would help the most amount of people in the shortest period of time, and it would increase the standard of living far above and beyond what the poorest people had. That's the only situation where I would embrace it, and that's really the only situation where it would work. And when you hear about people talking glowingly about socialism, the ones who actually know what they're talking about, most of them are millennial college students in economics 101 who have literally no idea what they're talking about. They're stoned and they don't know what they're talking about. But I don't want to get too sidetracked here, but let me get into it, because I'm getting myself off into a tangent there. But oh gosh, I've lost my train of thought. You still with me, Justin?
Yeah, I got you.
Okay, I pulled out. Okay, I was flipping through my notes here, and so anyway, my point was, I would agree with it in a short-term scenario, a short-term situation where you had to improve the standard of living of a whole bunch of people in a really quick fashion. But there are no long-term benefits to socialism. And this has been proven over and over, whether you're talking about, a couple of the ones that you mentioned the difference between North and South Korea, East versus West Germany. We saw socialism in China, but now we see parts of China, like special economic zones like Macau and Hong Kong, which are doing well. In every situation where socialism and capitalism have competed side by side, in the short term, there may have been some, maybe not even wins for socialism, but some, on par economic outcomes for socialism. But in the long term, the situation has always been the same, right? East Germany failed and West Germany prospered. Eastern Europe failed, Western Europe prospered. The most prosperous areas of China are the deregulated economies in the southern part. So there is a reason behind this, and I'm going to go through the economic reasons behind it real quick. There's two things that I'm going to do. Number one, I'm going to explain in economic terms what Venezuela is going through right now. But then number two, I want to kind of connect the dots and explain the mechanisms as to why socialism is failing the economy in Venezuela. Because I think even for people on the right, it might be simple to say, like, if you're a right of center person, it might be easy to say, Venezuela, socialism, it's terrible. Yes. And then kind of stop there without really understanding what are the mechanisms within socialism that cause an economy to collapse. So that's going to be part two and probably the more important part of what I'm doing. But I'm going to go through three things that Venezuela is suffering from right now in an economic sense. And the first one is a lack of production, right? Venezuela suffers from a lack of production. They are producing fewer goods and services than they were pre-socialism. And this is one of the biggest problems. When you see pictures of grocery stores in Venezuela, and the grocery stores are void of any food. They have shelves that are completely empty. They have lines out the door, but there are no products, or very, very few products in there on the shelves. This is because they suffer from lack of production, right? There are not as many things. And that's the end result of when you see, people going through the garbage because there is nothing actually physically produced for them to eat. People eating their dogs or zoo animals or what have you. The most amazing thing about this, Venezuela sits on what is now the largest proven set of oil reserves in the world, more so than even Saudi Arabia. And to show you just what a problem the lack of production is in Venezuela, Venezuela is actually importing oil right now. Now think about that. This is the largest proven set of oil reserves on the planet, and they can't produce it. They're actually importing oil to meet their needs. And it's not just oil where they suffer from lack of production. And not just goods and services that are missing on the shelves, like retail goods and services, but other durable goods like steel production, for instance, is down 70% over the last decade. It's 70% lower today than it was in 2007. Car production is down 86% from where it was about a decade ago. And I read in an unbelievable statistic that in the car industry in Venezuela, they are producing something like, and this is nationwide, like 10 cars a day. And that's it, which is, that is an astonishingly low statistic. So the biggest thing right now, the reason that you see people with nothing is because the country is not producing anything. They're suffering from lack of production. Second thing that Venezuela is suffering from is a lack of money. And I know that seems like almost stupid. I'm not trying to be a dumb guy here and say, hey, there's people digging through dumpsters. My explanation is that they don't have money. No, actually, as a country, as a macro economy, they are suffering from a lack of money. And Look, I think it was Margaret Thatcher who said in the 1980s, the problem with socialism is eventually you run out of other people's money. And how prophetic that was. She wasn't necessarily talking about Venezuela, but she was talking about Eastern Europe. But that is what has happened in Venezuela. They have run out of other people's money, the producing people's money. Not just that, but people from around the world where Venezuela is exporting their goods. Venezuela is running out of their money. This is exactly what's happened. The basic way that it works under the, nationalized, socialized economy is Venezuela. What I mean here by socialism is the state, the government owns all of the factors of production. They own all of the materials. They own all the raw materials. They own all the workers. They own all the capital machinery. The government owns all of this. So they, given that they own the oil industry, they export the oil in return for money. Money comes back to the government, and because of the lack of production that I identified in part one, they have less money coming in. And so this is problematic. The government can't keep their promises that they have for the 30 million people there. And it's not just petroleum, although that is problematic. They are lacking petroleum revenue, but the non-petroleum goods and services exports from Venezuela, right? So this is where they're getting their international currency, their international reserves, which are vital for them to be able to purchase goods and services for the country. Those international exports, non-petroleum related, are down about 80% from where they were 10 years ago. I mean, this is astounding. So you have, in terms of US dollars, you have 80% less coming in than you had a decade ago. Why? Again, see problem number one. There is less production, so there are less things to export. There is less money coming in. And with less money coming in, the government simply can't, now that they are the providers, they simply can't provide the goods and services, the healthcare, the education, whatever it is that a country needs to have. I will say this on a side note. Look, they're running out of money, but I want to say this on a side note. Nicolas Maduro, he did increase the minimum wage by 30%. He did this in an executive decree, which now this is the legislative process that is allowed in Venezuela, just executive decree, they can do this. He said the minimum wage is going up 30%. For whatever that means, never mind the fact that the people are digging through dumpsters, at least he raised the minimum wage, right? So not only that, since he actually instituted that policy, there have been, let's see, this was 2014, I think he had this Fair Prices Act. There have been 4 million lost jobs in Venezuela. There were 4 million more jobs in Venezuela in 2014 when Maduro was elected than there are now. I mean, it's just absolutely devastating for the people. And that's just, I mean, it's amazing because you hear Bernie or Hillary or any of the leftists who say, hey, all we have to do is raise the minimum wage, as if it's some magic. Here you have a country that is teetering on the brink of economic collapse, and they did just that. They raised the minimum wage 30%, and 4 million jobs vanished, and the people have literally nothing. It's really sad. All right, let's go here. Number 3, you mentioned this, and I think this is an important point because not only are they suffering for lack of money, but the lack of money that they do have in Venezuela is now worth nothing. They are suffering from hyperinflation. So you have a lack of production. This results in a lack of funds. But the problem is you have no lack of promises for the people. When Chavez came into power, he promised them this and that, A, B, and C, healthcare, education. I'm going to promise you all the bread and whatever it is that you need, I'm going to promise you. And again, in the short term, this is probably going to be fine. This will probably work out, but this is a neglect of the long term. So, they nationalized the oil. They took the oil revenues, and what did they do with them? They spent them lavishly on the people to keep the people happy. And again, if you want to look at one of the things that, like I said in the beginning, the college students, and again, I didn't want to get off on a long tangent, but one of the things that we had talked about there is in a situation like this, poverty went down in the first, like whatever it was, 3 years. And so these kids, you can look at that, or millennials or anybody who's pro-socialist, you can look at like certain like statistics within a 2 or 3 year period. You can even look at this. You can go back to Mao's China before they had these great famines, which killed tens of millions of people. And you can look at gross domestic product statistics. You could say, you know what? Right after World War II, when Mao was in power, look at that. GDP actually went up. Unemployment went down. The statistics look okay. In this very, very tiny, quick, immediate, short-term window, sure, there can be some benefits where the government exports stuff, takes the money, the revenue in, and instead of investing it, they just spend it, and that's going to boost GDP. But this does not mean that it is a healthy economy by any sort. So anyway, they nationalized the oil industry. They promised the people the world. They spent all of that. Now that production is declining, they don't have all of the money that they need to keep all of the promises that they made to the people. So they're going to face a coup, a revolution by the people who don't have anything. So what did they start doing? This was about 5 years ago. What did they start doing? They started printing money to make up for the shortfall. Right? They didn't have the money because they weren't getting it from exports, so they started printing it. And
that sounds familiar.
What's that?
That sounds familiar.
Yeah, exactly. I know, seriously. Even the worst student in my economics class can figure out that if you just print money, if it's not produced and saved for, then it's gonna result in hyperinflation. And you see the inflation rates. In Venezuela, they went from 50% a few years ago, which is an astounding figure by itself, then doubled to 100%, tenfold up to 1,000%. Inflation rates are now like around 2,000% in Venezuela. It's incredibly sad. Hey, Maduro did raise the minimum wage. Don't forget that. But it's incredibly sad because the money that the people do have is worth absolutely nothing. Right. So they made all these promises that they had to keep to the people. They didn't have the revenues coming in. So they just printed the money, and that devalued all of the currency, all of the savings, all of the hard work that these Venezuelans had done. All the money that they had in their bank account was just destroyed by the wave of a wand by these two idiots who were in charge for the last decade. It destroyed all the currency. And so now they can't sell it. Nobody will take this currency. It really is a dire economic situation. If we step back and kind of look at what I've talked about here, you have an economic picture where there are no goods and services being produced. There are no goods and services being imported. The money is worth nothing. There are people dying in the streets, and the answer is socialism. It is socialism that is producing this, and it just astounds me to no end that we are in a country where I see these statistics come out where it's like 57% of voters ages 18 to 30 would prefer socialism over capitalism. It's just idiotic. They have no idea what they're talking about. And, people who are kind of in the know, they might say, well, no, it's not socialism, it's falling oil prices. But that's a BS argument because, look, there are plenty of countries. Which other OPEC country is going through this right now? Right? Saudi Arabia, do we see them going through this? No. United Arab Emirates, Qatar, do we see any of these countries going through this? No. Angola, they're completely oil dependent, and they're not even going through this. They're one of the poorest countries on the planet. They're more economically stable than Venezuela. What is the difference? The difference is socialism. So that's where I'm going to get into part two here. And it's okay. So what does that mean? When I say socialism has caused that, what are the mechanisms there? What is actually happening? How do we connect A to B to C to prove that it's a socialist economic system that is dragging down the economy? Let's see. Let me back up real quick and let's redefine it. Socialism is where the government owns the factors of production, right? They own the minerals, they own the all the raw materials, they own the labor, they own the capital. And for instance, they own the oil, and they own the oil workers, they own the oil machines, the technology, the research and development that would go into energy production. They own all of that. Now, free economy. Okay, if this were a free economy and this were a private enterprise, if let's say Venezuelan oil was a private enterprise, then these oil profits, when they come in, a good portion of them, a chunk of them, they go to long-term production. So they go into like not only like repair of the current capital, but improvement in the current capital. They go into research and development into economic products that are going to yield benefits far into the future. This is what capitalism is. It's taking your profits and investing them so that there will be profits and there will be goods and services available for the public in the long term, right? And I've talked about this, previously. Socialism is just a short-term phenomena. So early on in the 2000s, when the oil revenue was kind of flowing in, what did Chavez do with them? He spent it. He spent it lavishly on the people. And yes, I will admit these statistics. The poverty rates dropped immediately in the short term in Venezuela, right? But that is mindless thinking. It doesn't matter. I will concede that will happen every time, right? But in the long term, because the capital was left in disrepair, because there was no research and there was no development, there was no long-term investment. Now here we are a decade later, 15 years later, in the long term, and there is no production. So it's a lack of investment that you see in socialism, which causes the long-term deficiency. And again, if you're comparing East and West Germany, look at the first few years. They're going to be on par with each other. If you're comparing North and South Korea right after the Korean War, look at the first 2 years. They're going to be on par with each other. Heck, the USSR, GDP-wise, did a great job in the 50s compared to the United States. That doesn't matter. It's look at 20 years later and what has happened. And they all collapsed. It's only the capitalist countries that were able to succeed because they're the only ones who have a profit motive for long-term investment. Right? I mean, imagine the government of Venezuela trying to say, look, okay, we're making billions and billions in oil revenue, but we're going to invest it in something that will yield goodies 15 years in the future. The public's not going to buy that. And Maduro and Chavez, they understand that. So that's why they, spend it immediately and then kick the can down the road and worry about it later.
Well, and that was one thing that I was going to jump in real quick too and mention with that. And I think you were doing a fantastic job of defining it. Is the supply and demand in the market aren't able to be determined by the market, right? And so when the market is trying to determine what should the supply be of oil to the market, what's the demand for it, it can't happen naturally because the government is controlling how much is being produced and therefore is either limiting, throttling production, and then the market can't meet what it needs. Like you were talking about, the ability to be able to produce other things like steel and oil, and steel and clothing and other things that oil goes into. None of that can happen because the government is throttling that. And the big sell was always, the cheap gasoline, and it was almost kind of like they priced themselves out of the market with doing that. And there's stories of people coming over from other countries and buying up all the gas and stuff and taking it back home and reselling it on the market. So really that mechanism of not allowing the market to determine supply and demand, is another way of looking at the side effect or the issue long term. Like you were talking about, short term, yes, you're going to get that windfall of cash and you're going to see the government do what appears to be, it's like a shell game, right? It appears to be good things for the country, but it's not going to last.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you were exactly what you were getting into right here is what I want to finish with. One of the things that the socialist government did was they instituted price controls. This is a very populist thing to do, to institute price controls. In other words, you can't charge more than X for a gallon of gas. You can't charge more than X for a loaf of bread. The government institutes this and makes this law. Now, this is popular. And in the short term, it works, because look, industries might have some surplus inventories that they can get rid of at these low prices, but eventually you are going to have to produce these products. And a lot of the times when the government sets price controls on certain products, they set them either at or even below production costs, which means in the long term, these industries are simply going to end up losing money. So there is literally zero economic rationale for price controls, but we've even seen them in this country. There are cities that have rent controls. We saw in 2007, you saw cities go through they put gas caps. They said, hey, gasoline can't sell gasoline for more than $3 a gallon. And what was the immediate result? They ran out of gas because they stopped producing it, because the price-controlled price was set lower than the actual production cost. It always results in market distortions and creates economic problems. But a lot of the times those economic problems come a little bit further in the future. So the politicians can simply blame it on something else that has happened in their intervening time. That doesn't always get blamed on by the price controls. But what happens here is the government promises to make certain goods, quote unquote, affordable. This is a favorite word of politicians. This is a non-economic term and has no real world application, but affordable is a favorite. So, that's what Venezuela did. We're going to make gas affordable. We're going to make bread affordable. So they set the price low, and it's lower than the production costs. And I was reading a very interesting story about it's called a canilla. It's kind of like it sounds kind of like a donut or something when I was reading about it. But it's a South American favorite. It's kind of like a loaf of bread, but it's a sweet loaf of bread. And anyway, you can't find them in the stores in Venezuela anymore. And one of the reasons is because they're actually fairly pricey to produce. But the government set price controls on bread so low that the bakers, they have to use the wheat for other things. Otherwise, they will literally never be able to turn a profit. So this particular item that Venezuelans love just doesn't get produced anymore. That's what price controls do. They are designed to make everything affordable, and then guess what? Literally nobody gets them. They put in something called the Fair Prices Act of 2014. And again, the Fair Prices Act, this is something that might sound good, again, to that first year student at Berkeley who is high all the time and has taken a microeconomics 101 course. But if you have no knowledge of economic supply, demand, the market, and how it works, then this might sound reasonable. Hey, just set a fair price. That sounds good to everybody. But fair is another non-economic term that has no real world applicability. All right, and prices are what they are. They are reflections of supply and demand. And if you don't allow supply and demand to set the prices, then you're going to end up with distortions. And so, one of the things that proponents of these fair price controls or fair price acts say is that, look, if you don't set these price controls, then you're going to have greedy producers who just, they seek to rip off, the little guy. And if we don't put price controls on breads and basic grocery commodities, then the little people will just get ripped off because everybody needs food, and we're just at the mercy of these grocers. But look, I just went to Kroger yesterday, and I was able to get a loaf of bread. We're in an unregulated food market. I was able to get a loaf of bread for $1. I was able to get a carton of eggs for $1. I was able to get a whole chicken for 99 cents a pound. But whatever they say is going to happen simply doesn't happen in an unregulated market, because there is supply, demand, and competition to support the consumers. So, look, the bottom line is, whether it's socialism or minimum wage or anything else, political legislation cannot circumvent the real laws of economics. It's impossible. You can pass whatever law you want. You can pass nationalization of this industry or that industry, minimum wage law, Fair Price Act, whatever. It doesn't mean that the laws of supply and demand disappear. They're always there under the surface, and eventually they're going to get exposed. That's the economics behind it. What I'm curious to know about, Justin, is the moral, the government side of it. Where do these people get off just telling others that, look, I now have control of your life, and I'm going to dictate what you can and can't do and what you can and can't buy?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And it's one that, I think when you analyze and look at these governments, these countries that have instituted these socialistic authoritarian regimes over time, there's this promise. Here in the United States, even, we get into this kind of lull of, if we could just get the right person elected in office, whether it's Republican, Democrat, whatever. Oh, we just need to get the right people in office and we can solve all of the problems. And that's the fundamental problem here, right? Is that in these situations, there's usually some kind of unfortunate circumstance, whether it's a famine, a drought, war, something where the people are just desperate. They want something. And I think what you talked about is so important in understanding the government side of this as well. And that is, when you're in a situation like that, if, we can't really kind of wrap our minds around what that would look like. The Great Depression would be the closest thing in this country where people were just at wit's end and wanted solutions, and they wanted solutions now. And so when you talk about the appeal of socialism, it's that it does offer that quick pop, right? It's one of those things where you can look to the government, and when you can consolidate power, of course you can act unilaterally. Of course you can act efficiently. I mean, there's no doubt about it. These governments are really efficient at killing people, but they're really, really efficient because they can act without having to go through all the channels like we do here, for example, in a constitutional republic. And so these governments are able to amass the power of an authoritarian regime, and they're able to act quickly. And in the short term, you're going to see that pop, and the people are going to be appealed to that, right? They're going to say, "Oh yeah, this is great. This is much better." But then the bill comes, right? It's like when you're going through and you're eating at a fancy restaurant, you're feeling really good, and then that check comes, and you go, "Oh man, what did I just do?" And unfortunately, we're not talking about eating at a restaurant. We're talking about people's lives. We're talking about generations. We're talking about culture being wiped out. And so I wanted to kind of look at two different perspectives of what this means governmentally to Venezuela, and ultimately to the people around Venezuela, most particularly those that live in Colombia, Brazil, and the island nations off the coast of South America, because these people are being affected by the policies of this madman, or these madmen, both going back to Chavez and now under Maduro. And I would be remiss if I didn't really quickly mention, if you haven't researched or studied the history of Venezuela and Colombia, it's a really intriguing, it's almost like a soap opera, the way that it reads. I mean, going back to Bolivar and the freedom movement, there's a lot of intertwining here between the cultures of, what makes one Venezuelan, what makes one Colombian. At one point, when Colombia was battling through the civil war and the drug lord battles and things of that nature, people were fleeing Colombia into Venezuela, and now the shoe is on the other foot. So I don't want to make it sound like, hey, all throughout history, the Colombians were just kind of over minding their own business, and now all of a sudden they're being invaded by Venezuelans. It certainly isn't that. And when you get on these border towns specifically, as I was reading through some articles on this, you'll find a lot of overlapping of these cultures. As a matter of fact, I read through one article that said Maduro's mother was Colombian, and many people, almost kind of like the whole birther thing up here, many people wonder if Maduro himself was not born in Colombia, but that's neither here nor there. The point to this is
Trump on it. He'll figure it out.
Oh yeah, exactly right. We'll have birth certificates drawn up. The point to this is, in reading through and reading up on this specifically, you mentioned at one point being educated and knowing what's going on here. I would encourage our listeners to do that. Go through and run a quick Google search on Venezuela, Colombia, current status in Venezuela. You'll find all kinds of articles. I've got 3 of them from The Guardian. I've got one from Vice. I've got one from a gentleman who's with an organization from Global Americans. It's a research thing down in Latin America. He's in Colombia, and he's kind of reflecting on what he sees from his position in Colombia. That you can see the numbers, and when we talk about here, when we talk about people eating garbage and breaking into, this is not hyperbole, folks. This is reality. I know this is extremely hard to grasp and wrap your mind around, but this is the reality of what these policies have led to in the long term. And this has been over a decade in the making, almost 18 years now that this has been going on. So this isn't something that has just happened overnight. But what I want to focus on is when you look at the fact that, depending upon what points along the border that you look at, there's numbers as high as 150,000 people that have left Venezuela in 2017. When you look at 1.5 million Venezuelans that have left the country since Chavez came into power in '99. These are massive amounts of people. This is a city of the size of Indianapolis just being gone, being the people just up and entirely leaving altogether over a 20-year period of time. And that has an impact. That has an impact on Venezuela, and it has an impact on Colombia. And a lot of what I was reading in these articles talks about the fact that neither of these countries to be able to handle this. When you look at Colombia, their government is not equipped. Their towns are not equipped to be able to handle these situations. There was one article in particular that I was reading where the mayor of one town, and the name of the town that I was reading escapes my mind right now, but essentially the mayor of that town had tried to accommodate these refugees. And they've got people that are going over to the Middle East and they're looking at the Syrian. They're studying how Lebanon and how Turkey are managing the Syrian refugee crisis over there because they don't have the means to be able to handle this internally. And so they're trying the best that they can. They've got NGOs, these non-government organizations, the Catholic Church and others that are trying to help, but they don't know what they're doing. And they're letting people come in. You know, we had the big battle here about sanctuary cities, right? And they're letting people come in, and it was affecting business in Colombia. The businessmen were going to the Colombian governments and saying, you've got to do something. These people are hanging out all over the place. They're causing all kinds of problems with crime and prostitution. And so it's negatively impacting that. They try to move them to sports arenas and bigger venues to be able to hold more people. It's just becoming a crisis with cleanliness and disease and things of that nature that are starting to run rampant. So you're seeing this in northern Brazil. You're seeing this in eastern Colombia, and even in some of the island nations like Curacao, Trinidad, Tobago, other areas like that that are being affected by this. So this has a huge impact geographically on the region. That's why it's so important to keep stable regimes in place, right? And not just go around willy-nilly changing things up, or, you know, obviously wanting to see a country fail. But, you know, this is of their own doing. And I found it interesting as you were kind of going through the economic talk there, too, that a lot of what I read from the pro-Venezuelan side, they love to blame. They love to blame the evil West. They love to blame the Satan of America. I famously remember Chavez would get on TV and just rail on George W. Bush. And there was one time that he came to New York and to the UN to speak, and he would get on TV and serenade the people and just, you know, really try to get people to buy into it was America's fault. I read a story where Colombia over the holidays, they sent 55 tons of ham into Venezuela because the people were complaining. We don't have any ham for the holidays. What are we going to do? So Colombia sends 55 tons of ham. And Maduro's only response was, yeah, this is Portugal's fault. I kid you not. That was his whole thing. Now I'm guessing that maybe they were getting a lot of imports from Portugal for poultry products or pork products or what have you. And I know that there have been embargoes because of the way that this madman has been acting. And that's where I want to transition into the second part here is internally. What does this mean governmentally for the people of Venezuela? Unfortunately, there were mock elections that were held where essentially Maduro has looked to do one thing, and that's consolidate power. He's wiped out a lot of the state territorial powers. Many of the local government officials on ballots have been pro-Maduro candidates that have won election. And so what we're seeing here is a clear consolidation of more power. You might think, how can a guy like Maduro continue to consolidate power? And he's not going to stop. He's not going to stop until he controls every aspect, like you were talking about, unilateral legislation coming from the executive, judicial fiat, coming from the executive. It's just only going to continue to get worse. I read an article through Vice that talked about the fact that it's getting worse every single day, and the people are not sovereign. In our system of government, in liberal forms of government, we hold this as a cornerstone. When you look at the breakaway from the divine right of kings and those authoritarian regimes of Europe leading up to our revolution, there wasn't this idea that people get to self-determine, that the legitimacy of government comes from the fact that people give its consent, popular consent to the government to operate. This is not happening in Venezuela, and it will not happen so long as Nicolas Maduro is in power. He will continue to use paramilitary, his own military, to combat any kind of resistance. They've essentially stripped the citizenry of all arms. but yet they continue to resist, almost in kind of like a Tiananmen Square fashion. But ultimately, you lose hope. You lose, the ability to fight, and all you have left to do is flee. And that leaves behind desolate situations, no hope for a change. And so, I guess to kind of wrap up here, what's the end game with this? If the people cannot go to the ballot box and democratically try to change this, if they cannot fight back because they've been de-armed, what is their last hope? And as crazy as this sounds, I truly believe this, that I think the only hope for any kind of change is military conflict. And that was one thing that I read in a couple of articles where people were theorizing on, would Venezuela, as a last ditch effort to try to maintain any relevancy and to be able to continue to make it look like its government is functional, would they attack Colombia? Would they invade Colombia? Now, there's already been some minor skirmishes along the border, but we're talking about full-fledged invasion. What would that look like, internationally? Would America get involved with something like that? Almost certainly it would. What pressures would come from other countries? What support might Venezuela get, if any, from its allies, the few that they have remaining? It would be really interesting to see how that would shake out. Obviously, clearly, I'm not advocating for that. I would hate to see that. That would just make a bad situation 100 times worse. But unfortunately, it looks like that is the path that we're headed down. And, whether it be a civil war or, some support coming in from Colombia, or international presence that would essentially crush the Maduro regime to where he'd have to abdicate the throne that he owns in Venezuela and leave and institute a new government. I don't know. Long-term prognosis does not look good, unfortunately, for the people of Venezuela, and it is a real shame, as you mentioned, on a number of different points here, that there are people who look at this type of a scenario and think that it's viable. You can blame outside forces all you want, but when that's your only leg to stand on, when that's your only hope as to why you feel like socialism has not succeeded, it's always somebody else's fault. It's just not. It's not viable. It's not going to work. And so again, I would encourage you, if you're a Bernie supporter, if you're in favor of socialized medicine, socialized education, free transportation, free housing, free this, free that, I would encourage you to just do your research, just read, engage in basic economic theory, look at the situations in these places. Study Cuba, prior to Chavez, or prior to Guerrero and the Castros. Study North Korea prior to the Kim Jong dynasty, and just look at what has happened since these people have taken over. It can't be a coincidence that in every one of these situations and scenarios they fail, and it's not always somebody else's fault. So again, I think that we got to hope for a situation that minimizes the death and harm to the people of Venezuela, but restores some hope for a future where they can thrive once again.
Well put. I agree with 100% of that. It's a sad situation, and it's sad to look at it from where we are privileged. That's not a word that I particularly enjoy using, but I think compared to the poor people that we see in Venezuela, it's just sickening. It's gut-wrenching to see it. We enjoy the privilege of not living under an authoritarian regime, and contrary to what most leftists think, we actually don't live under an authoritarian regime.
Right. And just, for the listener out there that, is trying to bring some relevance home to this episode, what does this mean? We have to hold very fast to the principles that have gotten us to where we are as a country, because we could lose it very quickly. We fought through some periods of time where we, almost kind of slipped into this mindset. And I'm not saying we've ever approached anything close to this, but certainly there have been, epics in our nation's history where we've kind of been like, hey, we're teetering here, we're starting to experiment and float with some things that aren't going to be good for us in the long run. But hold fast and understand why we ascribe to the type of economic system that we ascribe to in capitalism, and why we ascribe to the type of government that we ascribe to in a democratic republic, and know that those are guaranteed. They only exist. Continue to adhere to those policies, they can just as easily be taken away. And I hope that that's what the listener takes home from this.
Great point.
All right. Well, that's going to do it then for this episode. And again, thank you for taking the time to listen to this. And I hope that it would, again, inspire you in some way, shape, or form to go out and learn either specifically about what's going on in Venezuela and the neighboring region down there, or to think about how this, again, would apply to us in our daily lives. And I hope that you can take something positive away from it. So that'll do it for tonight. I think we're going to try to get an episode up here within the next week or so on education. That's going to be a lot of fun. I've been putting a lot of effort in doing some legwork on this. I think it's going to be an exciting episode. We're going to bring Matt Newkirk in with us. He was on with Mike last episode. And so that'll be we're all three educators, and that'll be a really lively topic to discuss among the three of us. So until then, you've now heard the other side, and have a great evening.